July 18, 2026. In the last 24 hours, the United States military has done something it has not done at any previous point in this conflict. It did not just strike Iranian military infrastructure. It struck the leadership sitting directly above that infrastructure, and it did so in a single coordinated sequence that intelligence officials are now describing, off the record, as the most significant blow to Iran's chain of command since this war began in February. 3 senior IRGC generals, 1 deputy commander of the Aerospace Force, and according to 2 sources briefed on the operation, a communications hub inside Tehran itself that functioned as one of the last remaining links between the capital and what remains of Iran's dispersed military apparatus. This did not happen on the coastline. This did not happen near the Strait of Hormuz. This happened inside the capital, in the part of the country that the regime has spent 4 months insisting remained fully under its control. And the part of this story that almost nobody covering it in real time has fully processed is this: the United States is no longer degrading Iran's ability to fight. It is dismantling Iran's ability to decide who fights, when, and how. That distinction is the entire story of the last 24 hours. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why it matters more than any single explosion you have seen in this conflict so far. Let's back all the way up, because to understand how a strike campaign reaches into the capital itself, you need to understand the specific sequence of failures and decisions that got Iran's leadership to this point, and why the timing of this particular operation is not incidental. For the better part of 4 months, the Iranian military's senior leadership operated under an assumption that, in retrospect, has proven catastrophically wrong. The assumption was that Tehran itself, unlike the exposed coastal facilities near Bandar Abbas or Chabahar, represented a kind of sanctuary. Strikes had targeted radar installations, naval bases, missile storage sites, drone infrastructure. All of it concentrated along the periphery of the country, where Iran's military footprint was most visible and most exposed. The capital, by contrast, was where the senior leadership conducted its actual business, issued its actual orders, and believed itself several layers removed from the kind of precision targeting that had turned the coastline into a wasteland of burning installations. That assumption held for months. It stopped holding 24 hours ago. Here is the confirmed operational picture. General Amir Hossein Sabari, identified by multiple sources as a senior deputy commander within the IRGC Aerospace Force, with direct oversight of what remains of Iran's ballistic missile production and storage coordination, was killed in a strike on a facility on the outskirts of the capital. Sabari is not a name that has appeared prominently in public reporting throughout this conflict, and that obscurity was almost certainly deliberate. Officers who oversee production and storage logistics rather than public operations tend to be kept out of the spotlight, specifically because their operational value depends on remaining unknown. The fact that American and Allied intelligence identified him, tracked him, and struck him inside the capital tells you the depth of penetration into Iran's internal command structure has reached a point that even the regime's most protected logistical planners are no longer. Zaif. The second and third names confirmed in this operation are General Riza Kazmi and General Younes Hashemi, both identified as senior coordinators within what Iranian state structures refer to internally as the Joint Operations Directorate, the body theoretically responsible for synchronizing action across the IRGC's separate service branches, the ground forces, the Navy, the Aerospace Division, and the Quds Force. Read that carefully. This is not a body that commands troops directly. It is the body that is supposed to make sure the different factions of the IRGC are not operating in isolation from each other. We have discussed at length throughout this conflict how fragmented the IRGC's command structure has become, how its Navy, its Aerospace Division, and its Quds Force have increasingly operated according to their own separate institutional logic, rather than under unified direction. The Joint Operations Directorate was, in theory, the last mechanism that could have reversed that fragmentation. Killing 2 of its senior coordinators in the same operation that killed Sabari does not just remove 3 individuals. It removes the specific mechanism that was supposed to hold Iran's disintegrating command structure together. And then there is the fourth element of this operation, the one that intelligence officials are treating with the most significance even though it does not involve a named casualty. a communications relay facility inside Tehran, identified in briefing materials as a secondary node in the IRGC's internal command network, was struck and confirmed destroyed in the same operational window. This facility served, according to the sources describing it, as one of the backup channels used to relay orders and situational updates between the capital and IRGC units operating outside the immediate Tehran metropolitan area during periods when the primary communications infrastructure was degraded or under surveillance. In other words, this was the node that Iran's command structure had been increasingly relying on precisely because so much of its primary communications architecture along the coastline has already been destroyed in previous strike waves. The backup system has now been struck as well. When you eliminate senior commanders and simultaneously eliminate the communications infrastructure connecting whoever remains to the forces they are supposed to command, you are not conducting two separate operations. You are executing a single strategy designed to produce total decision-making paralysis at the exact moment the regime can least afford it. Now let's talk about how a strike campaign reaches this deep into the capital, because the answer connects directly to something we have tracked throughout this entire conflict: the specific intelligence collection methods that have made this level of precision possible. Iran's leadership has spent months operating under the assumption that distance from the coastline equals safety. But distance from the coastline does not equal distance from the surveillance architecture that has been quietly built up around this conflict for years. Human intelligence networks cultivated over decades signals intelligence collection that does not require proximity to function, and, as previous reporting in this conflict has confirmed, an increasingly sophisticated use of civilian-facing camera and sensor infrastructure that provides ground-level tracking data without requiring a single satellite pass or a single human intelligence officer physically present in the target area. Tehran is a city of nearly 10 million people, dense with exactly the kind of civilian infrastructure, traffic cameras, building security systems, telecommunications relay points, that this conflict has already demonstrated can be quietly exploited for tracking purposes. The officers killed in this operation did not simply forget to be careful. They were operating inside an intelligence environment that has become, over the course of this war, dramatically more penetrated than Iran's own security services appear to understand. Let's talk about what this specific target selection tells us strategically. Because there is a meaningful difference between striking a general because he happens to be a senior officer and striking a general because of the exact institutional function he performs. Sabri's role in missile production coordination means that whatever remains of Iran's ballistic missile manufacturing and storage logistics chain has just lost the specific individual responsible for keeping that chain functioning under wartime conditions, tracking which components are available, which facilities remain operational, and how to move materials between locations without exposing them to the kind of targeting that has already destroyed so much of Iran's coastal missile infrastructure. Kazmi and Hashemi's role in the Joint Operations Directorate means that the mechanism responsible for preventing exactly the kind of institutional fragmentation we have documented throughout this conflict has now lost two of its senior coordinators at the precise moment that fragmentation was already accelerating. This was not a campaign of opportunity. This was a campaign of precision, targeting the specific individuals whose loss would do the most structural damage to an already fracturing command apparatus. Now let's examine the reaction inside Tehran, because the pattern here follows something we have documented consistently across every major loss this regime has absorbed. And the consistency of that pattern is itself becoming one of the most reliable indicators available for understanding the actual state of Iran's leadership. Iranian state media confirmed the deaths of Sabri and Kazmi within hours. Hashemi's death has not been officially acknowledged as of this recording, and in the pattern this conflict has established repeatedly. That silence typically means either the circumstances of his death reveal operational details the regime does not want confirmed, or his actual status remains genuinely unknown to the people who would need to confirm it, which would itself represent a communications failure inside the regime's own reporting structure. The IRGC's public statement following the strikes described the operation as a war crime targeting Iran's sovereign capital, and promised what it called an inevitable and devastating response that History will remember. That specific phrase, or some close variation of it, has now appeared in official Iranian statements following essentially every major loss absorbed throughout this conflict. Read that again. If every promised devastating and historic response had actually materialized as devastating and historic, the operational picture inside Iran would look nothing like what we are actually observing 4 months into this war. The rhetoric has remained constant. The capability behind it has consistently failed to match the language used to describe it, and that gap, examined honestly, tells you more about the actual state of Iran's remaining military options than the rhetoric itself ever does. Now let's talk about what this strike into the capital does to the psychological calculus of every remaining senior officer inside Iran's command structure. Because this dimension of the story matters just as much as the operational details themselves. For months, officers operating away from the coastline, away from the exposed radar sites and naval facilities that had absorbed the overwhelming majority of American and Allied strikes, could reasonably believe that proximity to the capital offered a degree of protection that officers stationed along the periphery did not have. That belief has now been directly and publicly disproven. 3 senior officers, including 2 whose roles kept them deliberately out of public visibility specifically to preserve their operational security, were identified, tracked, and killed inside the perimeter of the capital itself. Every remaining senior commander inside Iran's fractured command structure now has to process the reality that geography no longer offers any meaningful protection. That realization does not simply produce fear. It produces operational hesitation, a reluctance to communicate through any channel that might be monitored, a reluctance to move according to predictable patterns, a reluctance to occupy any fixed position long enough to become a target. An institution whose senior leadership is operating under that kind of pervasive uncertainty does not function with the speed, confidence, or coordination that effective military command requires, regardless of how much physical equipment technically remains in its inventory. Let's connect this operation to the broader trajectory this conflict has followed, because the strike into Tehran did not happen in isolation. It represents the logical continuation of a targeting philosophy that has been building for weeks, one that began with the systematic destruction of coastal military infrastructure, expanded into the elimination of specific operational commanders whose institutional knowledge proved irreplaceable, and has now reached the point of striking directly at the coordination mechanism that was supposed to hold Iran's separate military factions together as something resembling a unified command structure. Each phase of this campaign has built directly on the phase before it. Destroying the coastal infrastructure forced Iran's remaining capability to become more dependent on centralized coordination out of the capital, since the dispersed periphery capability was being systematically eliminated. Eliminating the operational masterminds who understood how to use what remained of that infrastructure further concentrated the burden of coordination onto a smaller and smaller circle of senior commanders. And now, striking directly at the Joint Operations Directorate and its communications infrastructure removes the last mechanism capable of holding that increasingly centralized and increasingly exposed leadership structure together. Each phase made the next phase more effective, because each phase pushed Iran's remaining capability into a smaller, more concentrated, and ultimately more vulnerable configuration than the one before it. Now let's talk about what this means for the diplomatic track. Because this question has run through every major development in this conflict, and it applies with even more force here than it has previously. We have already established across multiple developments in this war that the identity and authority of whoever is actually capable of making binding decisions inside Iran remains genuinely unclear. That the supreme leader has been functionally invisible for months, and that the negotiating apparatus in Doha and Islamabad has repeatedly made public statements disconnected from the operational reality on the ground. Striking the Joint Operations Directorate, the specific body theoretically responsible for translating any leadership decision into coordinated action across Iran's separate military factions, makes that already difficult question significantly worse. If a ceasefire agreement were signed in Doha tomorrow, the honest question that this strike raises is whether there remains a functioning mechanism inside Iran's military structure capable of actually transmitting that agreement into compliance across the IRGC's separate branches. A negotiated agreement is only as durable as the institutional capacity to enforce it, and that institutional capacity, already weakened by months of fragmentation, has just absorbed one of its most direct hits yet. Let's talk honestly about what remains of Iran's senior military leadership after this operation. Because the picture that emerges when you step back from the individual strike details is genuinely significant. Over the course of this conflict, Iran has lost its former supreme leader in the opening strike of the war. It has lost a brigadier general in Shiraz. It has lost the operational coordinators overseeing drone authorization, mobile missile coordination, and regional liaison functions in a single coordinated strike window. And now, in the last 24 hours, it has lost a senior Aerospace Force deputy commander and two senior coordinators of its Joint Operations Directorate, along with a communications relay node that connected the capital to what remains of its dispersed forces. This is not a military leadership structure absorbing occasional losses while continuing to function normally. This is a military leadership structure being systematically hollowed out at every level. From the most senior public-facing generals down to the deliberately obscure operational coordinators, whose value depended specifically on remaining unknown. Every layer of that structure has now been touched. The honest strategic assessment as of this morning is this. The United States and its allies have moved through three distinct phases in this campaign against Iran: the destruction of physical infrastructure along the coastline, the elimination of the specific individuals whose operational knowledge kept the remaining infrastructure functional, and now, the direct targeting of the institutional coordination mechanism inside the capital itself that was supposed to prevent the entire structure from fragmenting beyond repair. Each phase has been more precise than the last. Each phase has reached deeper into territory that Iran's leadership believed was protected. And each phase has left fewer people inside Iran's command structure who are capable of coordinating a coherent response, let alone capable of enforcing compliance with whatever diplomatic agreement eventually emerges from the talks in Doha. What happens over the next several days depends on a question that has now become more urgent than at any previous point in this conflict: whether there remains, inside what is left of Iran's fractured leadership, any individual or institution with both the authority and the operational capacity to make a decision that the rest of the structure will actually follow. 4 months ago, that question was theoretical. This morning, after a strike campaign that has reached directly into the capital and eliminated the mechanism that was supposed to hold Iran's separate military factions together, it is no longer theoretical. It is the single most important open variable in this entire war, and neither Tehran nor Washington currently has a confirmed answer to it.